So it tells me we're live. Thank you for joining us again, Greatvannzinni. And
You bet.
I've got my standing co-host, the Shotgun Simon. Shotgun Simon.
Morning, chaps.
I see that.
Good morning, chaps from the UK.
And you're from Oregon again, Greatvannzinni.
I am. I'm from the Pacific Northwest in Oregon. Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Born up in Washington. Yeah.
Very nice.
I woke up this morning and the first post that I saw of any interest was a post by Simon. Sharing some information about the passing of Little Richard.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So before we kick off, do you guys want to share some views and opinions, personal or how it relates to our topic generally about the significance and importance of Little Richard?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, he was incredibly vitally important as a young man. Now, you have to remember, I had older brothers that were a little older, so they were listening to all these wild shows like American Bandstand and stuff like that. And on some of those shows was the first time we saw African Americans performing rock and roll. Now, we had seen, Nat King Cole had a show, and we had seen other African Americans, but it was really some of the first rock and roll with African Americans we had seen. So that was like, and where I come from in the Pacific Northwest was very white. A lot of had a large Native American population, but outside the big cities, not much in the way of African Americans. So, I was being exposed to that sort of, Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Fats Domino and all that sort of music that was pretty influential. Lots of good three chord jams within all that stuff that was just great, And so many of those songs, if you went to hear a cover band at a bar that was a bluesy cover band, you might very well hear Lucille, or certainly you're going to hear Johnny B. Good from Chuck, but but you're going to hear
Chuck Berry.
Yeah, you're going to hear the music from that time period, and it'll sound different. It won't be a straight cover, but it'll certainly be. It'll certainly be.
Wasn't one of the things, Greatvannzinni, that I've read that because obviously it's mainly run by radio. That radio is one of the things that radio is colorblind, and people didn't. People just. And I know that Alan Freed put on a show, didn't he? Put on a live show when he had like 5,000 people there. And he was amazed to see black and white kids just turning up for this rock and roll show that he put on.
That's right.
And he hadn't realised that black kids and white kids were buying rock and roll records.
Everybody was tuning in.
Everyone was buying rock and roll records.
Yeah.
It was the radio. And of course, nobody, a lot of the time, people didn't know whether you were black or white on the radio. You could be who you wanted to be. As we've talked about on here before, the age of the, what people were like, what people looked like, and, was quite often quite difficult to know.
Yeah. I think later, at a later time, I think that changed a little bit. But I think in those early days, people didn't really know. I know our radio station was small, and we didn't get much in the way of Motown at all until the big ones hit, like the Supremes and some of those groups, So
the early 60s.
Yeah, and then we started getting some airplay from that. So I still I went back just about 3 or 4 weeks ago and watched one of my favorite guitar players, Bugs Henderson. I listened to him do his version of Lucille as an example, which is not at all like the original, but it was very good. So I guess Greatvannzinni, he's been part of your musical growing up, because he's been around ever since you've been listening to music. Yeah. I for me at my age, yes, I was exposed very early. At that time we were in Kelso, Washington. There was, There was just no music like that at all, and I don't even know if they had. I'm not sure what they had for live entertainment at that time. Probably country western mostly, but yeah.
Well, good question.
So,
Yeah.
but we were starting. We got to see it on TV. You know.
Yeah.
So I think those songs were just incredibly influential. I mean, we did all those songs, Tutti Frutti, everything. You know, starting out as a band to try to do them in a different way, and a way that fit my generation. You know, so
well, you're in good company, Greatvannzinni, because my initial experience of knowing who Little Richard was as an artist was through my love of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, because they were covering a lot of these early rock and roll songs and
yes, indeed,
their bands, even during their skiffle period, and you read accounts where Paul McCartney could pull off Little Richard, and that's what probably got him into the band.
Isn't that what got him into? Isn't that what got him in? Right? That was my understanding. He did a Little Richard thing, and they went, "Wow, he can do Little Richard."
Yeah.
He is a great screamer.
When only 3 or 4 years after the fact, when Little Richard was hot. So this is what I love about the music that I listen to and the subjects of the shows that we do, because these guys are the gatekeepers and the gateways to a further investigation back. And in fact, Simon and I were having a chat before the show, a pre-show chat, talking about how it's important, I think, if you are going to be a music fan, to at least take some kind of intellectual responsibility and do some archaeology, especially if you're going to give yourself a title of being at least a bit of an expert on something. And I think that's one of the great things about, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. They gave us, right from the word go, hey,
exposure.
Chuck Berry nuts. Yeah. We love Little Richard. When we heard Little Richard, it was like, oh my God.
Didn't Keith Richards said that when he heard Little Richard for the first time, it was like the world went from black and white to Technicolor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fantastic kind of, and that,
and it's true for all sorts of music around that time. As an example, I mean, we heard stuff that was rockabilly, but we didn't know it was rockabilly until sometime later when we heard the Beatles doing some stuff, and we like, who's Carl Perkins now? Wait a minute, and so we had to.
That's interesting.
For us anyway.
It's a lot of talk about.
It was about kind of a circular thing,
back to America. But also, the Carl Perkins, if you like, not obscure, but what we don't think of obscure now, but we're then much less well-known rock and roll artists.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I didn't know. I remember my brother bought a Johnny Cash 45, and on the flip side was Luther played the Boogie Woogie, and I had no idea who Luther was until years and years later, and then lived under the false belief that it was Carl Perkins' brother, so not related at all. But and that was my introduction to Luther Perkins. So
I mean, I think for me, Little Richard. I mean, that a wop bop a loop up a lot bam boom is it's a clarion call to a generation, isn't it? That's like kicking down the doors of post-war. Black and white, rationing, whatever, and and saying, "I'm alive," and revolution is upon us, brother.
And we certainly didn't recognize it as such, but when you look back at something, that sort of thing is sort of that call is, this is our generation, and we're not going to be the same as our parents' generation. We're gonna
and I think that
strike out on our own a bit.
Well, that's right. That's striking out, and especially musically. Dylan, Keith Richards, all these guys. They just heard. Bob Dylan wrote in his yearbook at school, I'm off to join Little Richard. You know, he wrote in his leaving book.
I did not know that. Oh wow!
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
From
How interesting,
Minnesota when he went to school.
Uh-huh.
He wrote in his thing, "Off to join Little Richard," which is fantastically cool.
It just blows me away how these guys that we love, you know, in the first place, you know, Bob Dylan, you know, Eric Clapton, you know, the Stones. We love these guys, and it just blows me away how I think you said the word, Simon, earlier, how revolutionary listening to Bebop Looper, She's My Baby was for a generation of young Americans and young Britons, and obviously Kiwis, because my mum, so I find out that the Beatles love Little Richard, so I go to my mum and say, Mum, did you listen to Little Richard? And my mum's going, yes. So I sit down, you know, my mum tells me about how she listened to Little Richard and went and bought the 45, and, you know, and they would have dances, and, you know, so I'm going, oh, wow. So even here in New Zealand, you know, we had people flipping out, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, that you can't underestimate those things, and the ripples they had, you know, as you say, Paul McCartney could do Little Richard, which got him in the Beatles, and, you know, they were massive fans, you know, when he said all of a sudden, the Beatles were influenced by Little Richard, yes, and, you know, he was around.
And we didn't include him, but I remember conversations years ago when I was much, much younger, like who had the best scream? Who screamed the best, you know? And certainly,
Won't Get Fooled Again, you see.
And McCartney was on that list, certainly, and you know, and of course, had certainly Little Richard should have been. We were kind of past that time, though, so yeah.
No, but and things get, and you don't recognize. I mean, because I wasn't there at the time, so, you know, for me, Little Richard is, you know, already in the sort of, I probably heard it in the late '60s, you know, but, you know, was more that. You know, because then, you know, rock and roll, you know, 12, 14 years later was kind of old then, wasn't it? By the late '60s.
So,
you know,
well, his
in the early '70s, you had Shannon Art. They were a kind of heritage act, weren't they?
Yes, they were almost like a tribute band, almost. Yeah.
And yet they were less than 20 years later. Whereas now, you know, that'd be like somebody from 2003.
That's how far music had kind of moved on.
Going to seminary, was that his like going to the army phase for Little Richard? Was seminary school his army phase?
I don't know if it was or not.
Well, I don't. Yes, I mean,
that would have been a
wild boy in many ways. It's you know,
yeah. I mean, he wore many different hats,
many different dresses apparently.
Yeah.
He went on tour as a. You know, he went on tour with a snake oil salesman, and, you know, all sorts of stuff like that as a teenager. He didn't. I've not read of him being in the army, and I suspect they turned him away fairly.
Oh no! What I'm saying is,
not
you know how
literally.
Went into the army at the height of his popularity in '58.
Yeah.
So Little Richard, you know, because they're following a model, you know, before them, you know. Jerry Lee Lewis, you know, he married his 13-year-old cousin, so that was his that was his mea culpa. And, you know, so I'm asking you guys, you know, do you think, you know, because he turned his, we're talking about Little Richard, he turned his back on rock and roll for a while.
Religion,
and went to, you know,
became a minister,
a minister. So is this some kind of thing that Americans have to do? You know, we've got to go away, you know, and then come back and
what do they call that? The search for oneself,
search for identity,
and for the meaning of it all. Yes, vision quest. Yeah,
I didn't get the impression that Little Richard was out searching for himself in a different way, but not in that. But I think maybe there's a great sort of theory, isn't there, that the death of rock and roll is the day that Elvis went into the army. That's the death of rock and roll. You know, and after that, it was you know, the whole thing. You know, it lost its figurehead. You know, the Adonis Elvis Presley. It lost that, and therefore it lost as a movement. It lost its way, and kind of, you know. and then the next movement was the Beatles. 5 years later.
Yeah, and there was sort of a somewhat of a gap. We always refer to the day that the music died when Richie Valens and Buddy, and it's right, and that was a term that was used prior to that, yeah, and Buddy Holly, yeah, and so there was sort of a gap from that, and Buddy Holly's not straight pure rockabilly, but he's close enough, and but there was a kind of a gap there where things developed. And you heard a lot of Pop 40 probably in 59, 60, 61 that was really quite all over the place. And then at some point, for us on the West Coast, of course, out came the Beach Boys. And it was all about the surf movement and all that.
They copied Chuck Berry, didn't they? Quite a lot of the Beach Boys when they first started. It was a great Chuck Berry influence there. Good morning, Arvin. How you doing?
Arvin, good morning.
Evening, girls.
Here we go.
Well done. That's good. So, yeah, I mean, and I think that to put that you're right. There were a whole lot of sort of signposts that kind of that 3-year kind of a bit like punk. Punk was 76 to 79. By 79, it had gone really, and it moved into something else as a movement. And it's an interesting theory there, isn't it? It's about our musical movement's actually only about 3 years, kind of thing.
That's right, because here was the Beach Boys and the hot rod movement and all that kind of stuff, and then came these guys from England, the Beatles, and that just really changed things. I mean, that really.
I was just thinking,
it made everything look different. Yeah.
If you think about the British blues explosion, that's what 66 to 69.
Yeah.
And then people started moving into other areas. Expanded their their things out into other areas of
And in some cases, stuck with the blues, but just made it sound very, very different. The
Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones killed.
And some of Led Zeppelin's.
Yeah.
If you didn't know much about blues or history, you would listen to some of that Led Zeppelin stuff and never ever draw the conclusion that I'm listening to something that has blues as a roots kind of thing.
It's funny. I always got that Greatvannzinni.
You always did?
From 71, 70, when I first started getting to Led Zeppelin.
I think I did, but I was there, so yeah.
Well, yeah.
I saw that, I lived that progression, so yeah.
Yeah, but whereas, I always knew that Led Zeppelin, that line
had that basic,
that there was this line back to Muddy Waters and Howling Wolf and whoever else, back to these blues guys, these American blues guys. I knew that, and I'm one of those people who arrived in the middle and then went back and to discover people like Howling Wolf and Muddy Waters and stuff, and Mississippi John Hurt and all that, Robert Johnson and things, So I went back via probably Led Zeppelin, more than it. But the Stones, particularly, they sort of, they started off as a blues band, but by the time you get to 66, 67, when they're doing Satisfaction and they're doing, Satisfaction has a link to the blues, but it's not a blues song. As kind of, I Can't Get No Satisfaction is a classic blues motif and theme, but it's not da 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 da. Is it? It's kind of moved on from that. And hats off to them for doing that. That's fine. That's good, fantastic. Moving it along. But
did move along. Yeah, and the Animals as well. Blues, I think.
All of those British blues artists, that we discussed, Van Morrison, started off very much as a blues singer. The Animals, Spencer Davis Group, obviously Eric, but also people like. Paul Kossoff from Free, they started off very kind of bluesy, but
I've not actually heard a lot. The few little things I've heard from them, I just absolutely love, but I've not really.
Free, fantastic group, because they had brilliant musicians. Paul Rodgers is a great singer, still, but he was a great singer then. Paul Kossoff was a great guitar player, his own thing, and Simon Kirk, brilliant drummer,
Yeah.
Do Boz Burrell, was it Boz Burrell? Yeah, the bass player. But Andy Fraser, of course. Andy Fraser was the bass player in there. Andy Fraser wrote All Right Now when he was 18 or something.
Yeah,
Wow.
Andy Fraser
Isn't that
joined
something?
that band when he was 16.
16.
He was
really?
a child prodigy. So
child prodigy, Andy Fraser.
Being a bass player, Greatvannzinni, I advise you over the next couple of weeks, if you've got some spare time, to check out the first 2 albums by free anyway. Certainly, and you'll be blown away by.
I have Spotify now. I can do that.
You can do that. Yeah. I agree. Check them out because they had a thing of their own.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't like the other guys, and as I said, they had great players. I mean, Simon Kirk is a great drummer. Really, really good drummer, and as you say, Andy Fraser was 16 when he joined Free. That dum 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 dum. No, that's all Andy Fraser. It was just brilliant. And iconic bass line.
Yeah.
Surely.
I learned something the other day by having a chat with a drummer, because I don't know anything about drumming, but I like to consider myself, because I'm a guitar player, I like to consider myself a bass player. But what's interesting,
at least,
is that
get close.
as we were having a chat about surprise, Charlie Watts.
Yeah.
And I said to my friend, I said, so what makes Charlie Watts so good, because everyone talks about the swing. And he said, Andrew, when a drummer talks about swing, it's the amount of time that they go from hitting the bass drum to the snare. And some drummers will be in front of the beat, and then some drummers, obviously, it's that space between hitting the bass drum and the snare. And I'm going, oh, okay. So linking that back to Free, I think Free were a wonderful example of a band locking into that beat right from the word go. They had swing.
They did a lot like those bands then. They understood that it was the roll, not just the rock.
They were from were they from the UK?
They were from the UK.
Okay,
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I see. Yeah, that's exactly right, Arvin. So you went in like me, went in the middle, and then obviously Hendrix as well. But went out and discovered what the roots of it were.
Yeah, I remember when I first heard Johnny Winter. I can tell you right where I was, and when I saw Jimi Hendrix and heard him this first album. Yeah,
I probably saw Johnny Winter. No, maybe not actually.
Well, Johnny Winter was my brother. Also bought blues albums. My older brother, and he had more money than I did. So our very first blues album in the house that was kind of what I would call white kid blues was the Blues Project live at the Cafe A Go Go, and that was before I got the Beano album. It might have even been before the Beano album was out, any of Paul Butterfield stuff. So that was our first thing on there. But I remember at some point my brother brought home that first Johnny Winter album, and there was such I don't think it was actually a live album, but it was like live in the studio. Yeah. It just sounded so right there. And I remember thinking, oh man, I gotta learn some of this stuff. I gotta see this guy. I mean, he really, my ears really perked up when I heard him.
I think I first came across Johnny Winter because he was on a British rock show called The Old Grey Whistle Test.
Oh, okay. I've heard of it.
Well, he appeared in, I think, about 73, 74 maybe, and he playing Jumping Jack Flash. He did this extended version of Jumping Jack Flash, which had this whole bit on the end, that sort of solo bit and stuff. And I remember seeing him then. And I was like, I'd obviously read about him as well in the NME, the New Musical Express, rock paper of its time. So I obviously knew vaguely who Johnny Winter was, but I didn't really get into him until he did the blues albums, Muddy Waters, Hard Again, and those things. That, and he did his own ones. We used those musicians, didn't he, to make his own records. A couple of, and they were really good. I like those. I had those.
Yeah.
I don't know if this quote is true, but Keith Richards apparently said only a guy from Texas would do a cover of Satisfaction like that. So probably some truth in that quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keith's up for a good quote, isn't he? It's
roll the dice. Yeah, they certainly do that down there. So.
Yeah. So
his live record, yeah. Yeah, he was great. I mean, as I always said, it's so inappropriate that I never liked Firebirds, but I own an Explorer, and that's as close as I can get to without it being a Firebird. Yeah,
that funny.
Could have gotten a Thunderbird, I guess, but
yeah.
And that's very Johnny Winterish. That's as close as I can get for me. So, yeah.
Arvin says that that Johnny Winter and the live record got me through my first 3 years of high school.
I see that.
It is pretty cool. Yeah. So it's that's interesting. George Clinton described it like that as well.
Yeah, I remember
Andrew's got the spinning wheel of doom. So,
I remember Hendrix's first album. My drummer's brother was a studio musician down in L.A.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and he was in the studio. He was in Capitol Studios at the time, working with some of the Wrecking Crew folks. So, but he was sending albums up long before we got them. 2-3 months, sometimes more. And
wow.
he sent up a whole bunch of albums of all these different groups all the time, and we'd see them before they'd ever show up in the store. Of course, our stores in Salem were kind of slow to